this forum is Sabine Kirchmeier-Andersen of Denmark. Just to say very few words about Sabine, she actually started out from a big language, German, and then she voluntarily moved to a small language. And to really get deep inside this language, she married a native speaker, then she got a native speaker child, and then she decided to work in the smaller language community. And actually quite successfully. One of her early appointments was in a large European machine translation project, whose name we all know. That many of the people in this room had one connection with the other two, and gathered their experience, practical experience and research on machine translation. Then she went into teaching and taught as a university teacher at a very, very good, at an excellent department of computational linguistics at the Copenhagen Business School. And she was made head of this department and did this until 2006, when she radically changed her career again. After having been already in smaller and medium-sized political offices, she became director of the Danish Language Council and at the same time member of the technology group of the Nordic Language Council. And even one more function that she fills right now, she's a member of the executive board of the Federation of European Language Institutions, national language institutions. So we are very glad to have somebody here with all this practical, theoretical, academic, political experience with our topic, with the very topic here of our forum. Thank you, Sabine.
Thank you very much, Hans. I'm going to I think I'm going to take the point of view of the user, but I'm going also to try to incorporate all that I know from the political side, and my point of view will also be mostly the Scandinavian languages that I know best, although German of course is, but everybody knows, or many people know German here. I can shortly say something about my outline of my talk. I give you some background info. What is the Language Council actually doing? What are the policy trends and language planning in Europe and in the Nordic countries? What is happening there? What sort of coverage do we see of languages with regard to language technology and MT? And I'll look at trends in language change and finally get some conclusions. The Danish Language Council is under the Danish Ministry of Culture, and we have the task of monitoring the development of the Danish language, providing orthographic standards for schools and public institutions, and advice on language use and things like that. In the Nordic language, we have just taken over the coordination of mutual understanding between languages of the Nordic countries. So as you may know, some of you may know that Norwegian and Swedish and Danish are mutual understandable to quite a large degree, and we try to use that, exploit that quite a lot, because each country has only very few speakers, or well, we have 5 million speakers in Denmark, and together Scandinavian speaking people are like 20 million, so we can sort of scale up a little bit our needs, and we're trying to exploit that, and the Nordic Council of Ministers is aware of that. And finally, as Hans mentioned, the European Federation of National Institutions of Language, they also have a task of promoting linguistic diversity, and they are also very interested in monitoring language development and language policy. So when we provide advice on information about Danish, we answer questions, we publish writings, we provide information in newspapers, radio and TV, and we cooperate with all kinds of people, terminologists, lexicographers, publishers, everything, as many as possible. And of course, we collect examples of words when we do our work, word usages. We track changes in the language, both orthography, morphology, syntax and semantics. We have research projects mainly on development of language, and we do contrastive studies. So what are the policy trends at the moment within language planning in Europe and in the Nordic country? Hans was a little bit about talking about how people would demand good situation, good language technology for their languages. When we look at the various types that we have in Europe, we have indigenous minority languages, we have polycentric minority languages, that means minorities that have their main development or the main number of speakers in another country. For instance, Hungary has a small minority in Slovenia, German has a small minority in the south of Denmark, and so on. We have national languages, we have contact languages. Big languages such as German, for instance, is a big contact languages that everybody in the border area can speak. And we have global languages such as English. And when we look at international language policies, we can see that these issues are discussed in very many organizations. So both UNESCO, the EU, and language councils in the North are having a growing concern for the national languages, as we also heard here in many cases. And they want them to stay as active bearers of the national culture in all domains. Most of the declarations that these organizations put forward, they recognize English as a working language and a practical tool of communication in certain situations. They want to protect their minority languages and the speakers, and they have this vision that everybody should learn foreign languages, and of course that the education system should support that, and the EU has launched this idea of having everybody knowing his mother tongue plus 2 foreign languages. So that is sort of something which is in every language policy. When we look at the map of Europe, we can identify very, very different language situations everywhere. So you have, for instance, as I mentioned, on the Hungarian border, you have this situation with Slovakia, and you have in Ireland, you have the development of the Irish language. You have in Poland, for instance, an interesting situation where all the languages at the borderline are being used as an asset for the rest of the country, and they are really working, there are very different agendas with the languages in Europe. And if we start focusing on the Nordic languages, you can see that we distinguish between state-constituting languages like Danish, Finnish, Icelandic, Norwegian. And Norwegian has a special situation that they have 2 languages, Bokmål and Nynorsk. I'll come back to that. And you have what we call society-constituting languages that are a little bit more. So Faroese and Greenlandic and Sami are included here. And you have minority languages such as Meänkieli that are sort of Sami languages and Queen. You have even Romani, Yiddish, German and sign languages, and they are all recognized as official languages in these countries. So when you take a look here, you can see up here in between Denmark and Sweden, you have a situation where you have Swedish and Finnish mixing in this area. So you have a Finnish minority in Sweden and a Swedish minority in Finland. You have the same in the Danish-German border region. You have the Sami, mostly in the north of Sweden and Norway, with various dialects that are being kept and preserved and developed. You have the bilingual situation in Norway, and actually that is a historical thing that they have these 2 variants. And one of the reasons is that Danish actually has been a very imperialistic nation. So in Greenland, which belongs to Denmark, they still have, they speak Danish as an official language, and so do the Faroese. And before that, the Icelanders did. They don't have to, I mean, they're independent now, but before that, Danish had, really an imperialistic tendency there. And they also had that in Norway. And in order to move away from the from the Danish influence, they invented Bokmål Nynorsk as a reaction to the Danish influence, so that they could have their own language, which is more Norwegian and which is compiled of various dialects of Norwegian. And this is a good example of how the historical situation and the situation of the society really influences the development of languages. But now what we see, of course, is English or American English or whatever English is influencing all these, and we can see that Icelanders, for instance, are not that interested anymore in getting into the Scandinavian discussion. Greenlanders are focusing on English, and so do most of the other countries, and that is, of course, a concern to the governments. So In the Nordic countries, we have a language convention that everybody can address public institution in their own language. That is quite a demand, that you can be, as a Finn or as a Dane or as a Swede, you can go in any of the other countries and demand that they serve you in your own language. And they're very proud that they are upholding this. And for instance, in Sweden, they have very, very extensive services for Finns, for instance, in many areas. And the expenses are paid by the states. And furthermore, they have a quite big focus on multilingualism and plurilingualism. So the Nordic region, they think of themselves as plurilingual and multilingual. And they recognize all these variants, and they are making laws in order to protect them and to develop them. There's a special obligation for Greenlandic, but at the same time there are 200 other languages being spoken in this area. So it is a highly multilingual thing. At the same time, there is a rather protective mood at the moment. So when you look at the relation between the Nordic languages and English, it's actually interesting that they are adopting quite parallel methods. So the Nordic languages as well as English should be used as languages of science. This is a text of the Nordic Declaration of Language Policy. So here you have a situation where people are really incorporating English into their language policies. So they say public scientific results in one of the Nordic languages should be highly regarded as published in English. We have the situation that 1/4 of the university's classes or courses are taught in English, as we have that same situation in Holland and probably also in Germany. And people are getting concerned about it, and they're trying to, sort of take some measures against this development, or at least trying to save or preserve their own language, as they can see that English is moving forward in specifically the scientific area. You see that universities are asked to have very good strategies for the choice of language, and you see that companies and industrial organizations also are urged to be encouraged to develop strategies for language parallelism. This is a rather defensive strategy for countries that are very highly developed, that they have a very educated population, and still they are really thinking very much about what's the influence of the English language do to us, and they feel the need to have these declarations and to work and try to work after these declarations. So this is actually, for me, when I look at this, it looks a little bit like countries that are sort of in fear of being endangered, although there are quite a number of speakers. So when you look at this normal sort of discussions from Ethnologue, for instance, the number of languages and how many speakers you need to be before you are an endangered language or considered to be endangered language, usually people say it's around 20,000 number of speakers, then you are starting to get into the red zone. But the way that the Scandinavian languages, the discourse of the Scandinavian language about this, seems that this maybe is going further up, so that even countries that are like 5 million people start feeling kind of concerned about the future of their linguistic identity. If you look at somebody like David Crystal, for instance, he wrote this book, Language Death, and we had other mentioning of this before. What are the critical factors for language survival? Of course, it's the number of speakers, the number of young speakers, writing traditions, use of language in education, status of the language user, and actually also access to language technology that has been mentioned before. And of course, the Scandinavian countries are sort of in the free with regard to the three first, but they are getting under pressure with the last point. So the status of the language is falling, and also the use of language in education is getting more and more towards English. So is there a need for language technology and MT here? Yes, of course there is. There are really important things that must be done in enhancing communication, not only within the Scandinavian countries, but also with relation to between the Scandinavian languages and other languages. More efficient communication is necessary, information retrieval is necessary, establishing communication with other languages, and enabling true parallelism. I mean, it's a strategy which is rather unique. I think that they are thinking about having a parallel strategy for their own language in parallel with English. And of course, one of the things that is necessary is to keep these smaller languages attractive on the international market. So there is a need for making sure that, for instance, international companies are at all interested in these languages. And if you've seen the presentations today, Swedish was mentioned maybe 1 or 2 times, but the other Scandinavian languages were not mentioned at all. So that shows you very much the situation. They are not the first languages that people think about when they are doing something for MT or language technology in general. And of course, this doesn't make people proud of their language. I mean, they easily switch into English because they have better services from there. It's very, very easy to see. And we had a discussion here today also about, well, will people accept to be served in English when they need to get public services, for instance, in spoken language or so on. And I think in the Scandinavian countries, since they are very good at English, they wouldn't mind. I mean, they would just say, okay, we'll do it in English. And I think that's a rather difficult situation. So, but I think there's one point that I should make here. We are talking about language technology and machine translation, but even more basic, there is a general need for national characters and national languages in general. I mean, we still find products, language technology projects on the web that cannot cope with our national characters. We can't. I mean, we can have URLs where our national characters are there, but we can't use them in our emails, for instance. And I think that's really a strange situation for language technology and web technology in general, that this is still a problem. I mean, instead of the Danish characters A, Ö, O, we write A, E, O, E, or A, A. And the last one, I mean, the last character O was introduced in 1945 in the Danish language, and it actually reflects a sound in Danish which we want to have in our orthography. But what happens now is that, for instance, I had a discussion on the radio with the mayor of Aarhus, who actually now has suggested that his city should change its name. So Aarhus shall no longer have the Danish national character, but it should have the 2 A's, because that would make international communication easier. And his reference is clearly that, well, it's easier to write the emails, it's easier to do many things if you don't have this very tricky character. And I mean, that doesn't either make people proud of their language, and it is a general tendency where language technology actually should be more in the focus and trying to do something for these special characters. Okay, if we look at the coverage of languages with regard to language technology and MT, we see that it's not surprising, but the Scandinavian countries are not very well represented. So this is, I think, still from the Euromatrix part. And if you look at the Danish, the Swedish, the Finnish, Norwegian, we are sort of moving towards where there's very few resources. And if you look at look into what is really registered in the Euromatrix, the number of MC systems is not very high, and only those that are in boldface are publicly available. And you can see the number of parallel corpora is also very, very little. It's very difficult to do anything interesting for the Danish language on the basis of these data. So at present, the largest investments in language technology in the Scandinavian countries are made in tools for Greenlandic and for Sami. They are developing MT systems and spell checkers and things, and that's also very necessary. But there's hardly any investment in the national languages at the moment. So there are no BLARCs. I mean, the Swedes are working on one, the Danes are not. So there's not sort of a consistent tendency there either. And there is a growing awareness that you need language technology infrastructure, but there's no investment or very little investments. There are term banks and text banks, and the Norwegians and Swedes are in fact actually the most aware people. They are financing these things with money from the state. And in Denmark you have resources and tool in DK Claren. We were lucky enough to get like 10 million Danish kroner, which is 1 million euros, to create a general language corpus, an LSP corpus, and some infrastructure, but we don't know where the finance is going. So also here, we are highly depending on somebody else being interested in doing something for Danish. So the status is that governments still believe that language challenges should be solved on a commercial basis in the Nordic country, and it should be left to market mechanisms. And the facts are that our local LT industry is extremely fragile. We have like maybe 2 or 3 companies, that's it, and they're fighting. And then we have the fact that small languages are not considered attractive markets. So it's impossible to think that this is going to be a feasible solution for Scandinavian languages. So that's one of the challenges. The other challenge I think we have is that languages change all the time, and this has been addressed a number of times here in the audience as well. And we have 2 types of language change, and one I have already sort of touched upon, that is language shifts, so that a community of speakers in one language shifts to completely using another language. And we have this connected with language death, and that is what's happened when languages disappear at the moment. And Fishman and Christian Humain and David Crystal have addressed this problem. And it is somewhat remote, but still it's sort of luring in the background for the Scandinavian languages. But then you have language change that has to do that the languages change internally, like you get new words, new constructions, and new senses. And I mean, they have been doing that all the time. You have always had these changes. And what is interesting now is that maybe it is happening even more now, because if we look at the communicative settings at the moment, before, centuries ago, we started writing letters and we used phone and email. We had this very one-to-one person communication. Now we are getting on with newspapers and magazine and web pages and books, and that means that we are sort of having this one-to-many communication that has been going on for many centuries as well. But now we have this many-to-many communication where you have chat, blogs, Facebook, Twitter, all kinds of communication where you have user involvement and user negotiation. And it seems that this is really changing the way that languages change. So if you look at the way neologisms are entered into the language, we can see, for instance, our measurements show that we get at least 30,000 new words in Danish a month. So when we take a 20 million word corpus and go through it and check what are new things here, there are like 30,000 words or word forms, and I mean, many of them are sort of transparent and compositional compounds and stuff, but 1,000 or 2,000 words in the general language are new. And that's at least 20,000 or 12,000 new words per year. We see that compounds, I mean, that is something which really is developing a lot. We see that acronyms are coming continuously, and even loan words. So we have very many English loan words. I just learned that fuck, for instance, has become a part of Danish newspaper articles. So it's the second most used swearing word in Danish, and it's entering the written language. So, I mean, the most used is sku, S-K-U, which means so help me God or something. 2.5% of this word are in Danish newspaper articles, but it's clearly followed by fuck with 1.1% of the occurrences in newspaper articles. So you see, suddenly you really get new developments in the language. You have words that are domesticated, like hockey mom comes into a Danish word. You have a word like nerd, which is spelled in a Danish way, and you have very translated expressions. Things like at the end of the day is translated directly into a Danish phrase, and you have mixtures of all these. And the most difficult part is probably that you get new word patterns and new senses of existing words. So, for instance, to stand up for somebody usually means that you get up because you're polite, whereas now the Danish meaning is also the English one, that you support somebody or defend somebody, or to hang out with somebody. You could hang things out, you could hang your clothes out, but now this hanging out with somebody is also a part of a Danish phrase. And these changes are very difficult to detect also for empty systems. system and other systems. Of course, they have been existing all the time. I mean, but it seems that at least for us, we can see that it is increasing. And also, various types of words are competing in the language. So here, for instance, you have the word exit poll, which was the only word for this thing that you could measure the outcome of an election or predict the outcome of an election when people come out of the election room. And there was no Danish equivalent until 2006, where there was introduced the Danish equivalent. And then you can see it is the dark green one, which is the Danish one, and the light yellow one is the word exit poll, and the Danish word is valgstedsmåling. And you can see now that once the Danish word has been introduced, it starts mingling with the others, and they're now fighting about which one is going to be the most dominant one. But these developments are not very well researched and not very well known. We don't know how fast this goes. We don't know how often it works, how often it happens. We can just see that it seems to be increasing. So language change and language shifts exist and have always done, so that's not new. But we don't know how fast they take place, and we don't know to which degrees these forms of the new forms of communication speed up these changes. So what we do when we speak together is we negotiate meaning, we negotiate phrases with each other. And this negotiation earlier took place, when we were talking to each other in our social interaction. But since the social media are now on the web and people are interacting in new ways, we really don't know what is going to happen there, and there are very little investigations of what is going on there. So what can we conclude here? As I said before, language diversity exists, but it's under pressure even for languages at the moment. Language technology and MT can, of course, contribute and help us improve the situation, and it can enable the language user to use their own language. But the development of language technology and the existence of language resources, it needs texts and speech corpora, and this is very crucial. And for the smaller languages, as we've seen before, the sparse language problem, these resources have to be freely available and to stimulate the development of products. And I think one of the biggest problems we have are these copyright laws and other legal obstacles that make it very difficult to give free access to corpus resources. So one solution is that you should go to, maybe the Commission should go for a general review of copyright laws, and that gives free access to corpus resources for language technology projects under certain conditions, for instance, via national libraries. In Denmark, we have the obligation for everybody who produces something printed that they have to give one copy to the National Library. So why couldn't there also be the obligation that this print should be available electronically for everybody that makes language technology, with some, of course, protections of printing? They should not be reprinted. I mean, no language technology person would ever bother to read these things. They just want to get at the data. So why? And there's absolutely no danger that people would violate this. I mean, and you can come after them as you can come after people that are misusing patents or whatever. And I think if that could happen, and if both translated and non-translated text could be available on a regular basis, there would be a good pipeline for continuous development of language technology. So that's one conclusion. So we have this, many LT products are not able to adapt to these changes. And that's another problem, that we have language change and language shifts, but you cannot adapt. So governments, they still think that these language technology projects and the compilation of resources are singular wins. You produce the data, you produce the product, and then nothing else happens. There's very little concern for how the system is maintained and how it continues to work. So the linguistic infrastructure should be maintained, and that should be sort of a continuous office. Like having electricity supply, we should have a continuous supply of language data, and it should be sort of put into the general legislation or the way that for instance, you give money to a project that you need to have people to provide for. How is this system that you're going to build being updated, and how do you ensure a continuous flow of data to update the system? So future projects must demonstrate, of course, how the products are kept up to date with regard to language change. I mean, in many cases it's already done, but I don't think it's done on a systematic basis. And I think also that maybe it would be a good idea to launch some research projects that investigate the nature of language changes at the moment, to check whether there's really going something on about quicker changes than we think. And then finally, it was mentioned earlier today, it would be a good idea to measure whether our efforts have an effect. And for instance, a general methodology for monitoring the development of the status and the corpus of languages could be a very good idea. And it has been tried in many ways. There is the Eurobarometer. It doesn't really measure everything. There is the Organization of European Languages language councils have launched a European language monitor that looks at various aspects. For instance, books printed in various languages, number of newspaper articles in various languages, teaching in language and foreign languages, and available of language technology. You could really try to make a barometer that shows or gives you some impression of what is the status of each language. And then you could also start measuring whether all the efforts that we are going here and all the good ideas that we are presenting here have an effect on the single language. And I think it's not something that we just do in one day and we just list a lot of things, because it has to be sort of maybe a part of statistical, measurement and a statistical investigation of languages. But it's something that has to be planned very carefully. But I think it would help seeing that all the projects that we are launching now whether they will have an effect or not. And I think that was the end of my talk.